welcome to BPF Futures Carbon Jargon webinar. And we are kindly joined by Ella Rivet from Planet Mark. She will walk us through the ABCs of carbon today. And as you know, sustainability is increasingly becoming an integral part of built environment and our business, and you hear about it every day as we transition to net zero. So many of you might come across these jargons almost everyday situations. So she will break it down for you, make it easier for you. And it also ties in with what we are doing internally. It's our sustainability week at BPF. And today's the last day themed around carbon, so ties in really well. So I'm pretty sure some internal BPF members would be keen to hear what you have to say as well. So Ella, I'll hand it over to you.
Amazing, thank you so much. I will bring my screen up and then we can get started. Has that come up?
Yes, can see it. Thank you.
Brilliant, amazing. So hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining on this really sunny day. Hopefully you can get out at some point after this to enjoy the sunshine. I am Ella. I work for Planet Mark within their built environment team, and here today to hopefully run through some carbon jargon and explain some words, some terminology, some concepts that are often used, and I think sometimes we can get bogged down without fully understanding what they all mean. So I'll run through kind of a little bit of scene setting, understanding kind of why we're here, go through some key terminology and the basics of kind of net zero in particular and sustainability, look at some of the key business drivers and why it's important for businesses to be thinking about net zero in particular. But as we go, any questions, please do use the Q&A function. I will we'll have some time at the end to run through those as well. So yeah, don't be shy. To start with, I'll just give you a little bit of background about Planet Mark and what we do. Essentially, we are a sustainability certification and consultancy. So we support businesses and organisations of all shapes and sizes, no matter where they're at in their sustainability journey, helping them to work towards carbon reduction and towards net zero. And there's a really incredible community of over 800 businesses, all shapes and sizes, and across all industries and sectors. But there has always been quite a heavy emphasis on the built environment, and we work really closely with developers, with investors, architects, contractors, and other areas of the industry to drive radical decarbonisation across their businesses, but also across their buildings and across their developments. And we've been working with the British Property Federation for the last couple of years to certify their progress, but also to help their members in their own transitions to net zero as well. And one thing that I think we found particularly important in the last couple of years is around sustainability related policy and legislation. I think it can sometimes feel a little bit overwhelming that something new is coming up almost every day. It can be tricky to stay on track and keep up to date and understand what's going on in this space. And I'll talk to policy a little bit more throughout the presentation, but it's something that I think we're really mindful of. And we're working with different trade organisations, governing bodies to help guide and inform policy as it is progressing and updating. And so that means that we're playing an active role in the sustainability landscape as it is being formed. But also that means that we can directly support our members in making sure they remain compliant and ahead of the curve. And with everything we do, we try to take a really holistic view, moving beyond that kind of tick box approach to focus on all aspects of business and how sustainability relates to that. So we know it's very difficult to manage what you're not measuring, and that's often a really crucial step in understanding both where you are and also where you'd like to be. It's also really important that you bring everybody on that journey with you. So you upskill, you engage your team, allowing them to play an active role in that kind of sustainability aspect of the business as well. And then we also know that you need to be able to share your journey, share your story, share your achievements around sustainability in a really credible and transparent way. So that's kind of a summary of Planet Mark and how we fit into this space, I suppose. So yeah, without further ado, let's dive into some carbon jargon. I think in terms of the definition of sustainability itself, there are numerous definitions and explanations for what that actually encompasses. I personally really like the idea that it is essentially, in simple terms, protecting the needs of our world, our environment, our society in the present, while also protecting the needs and requirements for the future. So it's that kind of forward-thinking lens, I suppose. And why this is so important is when we look at what we all know to be the climate crisis. So as you can see, in the last kind of 400,000 years, levels of carbon dioxide have fluctuated quite naturally, somewhere between 280 parts per million and 200 parts per million. So you can see the troughs here in the graph is where we would have seen ice ages historically. But it wasn't really until we started burning fossil fuels in quite serious quantities through the likes of the Industrial Revolution, for instance, that this has shot up to where we are today. And it's now at over 420 parts per million, which is actually 50% higher than what it was pre-industrial levels. So a little bit of background, the burning of fossil fuels essentially releases carbon, which has been stored millions of years, into the atmosphere. And though that increased level of carbon dioxide, as well as other greenhouse gas emissions, that is causing extra heat to be trapped in the Earth's atmosphere. That's what we know to be the greenhouse gas effect, or the greenhouse effect. And that's what's leading to rising temperatures across the globe. And in order to prevent runaway climate change, we need to rapidly cut our greenhouse gas emissions. Climate science tells us that we need to get to what we call net zero by 2050 at the very latest, if we're to stay somewhat between that 1.5 to 2 degree pathway of global warming. So what does net zero actually mean? Simply, it's the state that occurs when the total greenhouse gas emissions released into the atmosphere and the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions removed from the atmosphere each year are equal. So it's essentially that balance is struck. And this graph shows an example business pathway for net zero. So there's a couple of different elements to tease out. Firstly, setting a baseline which captures all emissions related to your business. That includes what we call scopes 1, 2, and 3, and I'll talk to those a little bit more in a moment. But this baseline is essentially your starting point, that line in the sand from which you can look to make emissions reductions. So this example uses 2020 as their baseline year. And then from that baseline, we're looking to achieve a minimum 90% reduction across all of your emissions by 2050 at the latest. When we get to that 90% reduction, those residual emissions of up to 10% that might just be unavoidable, they can then be offset with a specific type of offset called carbon removal schemes. And again, I'll explain that in a moment. Best practice guidance and frameworks such as the SBTi's corporate net zero standard also highlight the importance of near-term targets. And that's where this 50% reduction by 2030 comes into play. So net zero is really focused on significant emissions reductions across all areas of the business. And in reality, it's not going to be this beautiful linear curve that we see. It's much more likely to be the kind of the bars that we're seeing, where some years you make really significant reduction, and then other years it might feel like you're plateauing slightly. But it's important to take things step by step and look at where you can achieve reductions, both in the short, medium, and long term. So I'm sure carbon offsetting has come up in a conversation at some point or other, and there can be some confusion around what a carbon offset is. The first thing to highlight is that not all offsets are created equal. And if you are looking at purchasing any offsets, it's important to make sure that they are verified through credible schemes such as Gold Standard or BCS, and that they are from a credible provider. When it comes to the different types of offsets, there's two main types to consider. So there's avoidance offsets. these are essentially avoiding carbon emissions being released into the atmosphere. So this is your renewables, your solar power, your wind power, etc. And then there's removal offsets, and these actively remove carbon from the atmosphere. So examples would include things like carbon sequestration through tree planting, or peatland restoration, for instance, and also through technologies such as carbon capture storage. And I know there's a lot of really exciting developments going on in that space. The amount of investment needed to really make those a reality and make them feasible is immense, but it's exciting nonetheless. So for net zero, it's these offsets, the removal carbon offsets, that you need to invest in to get you or to remove those 10% of unavoidable emissions. So you need to focus on removal for net zero in particular. And when we look at your business's carbon footprint, we use something often called the greenhouse gas protocol. You can kind of think of that as the recipe book for carbon footprinting. It provides that best practice methodology and framework through which you can calculate a company's carbon footprint. And within the greenhouse gas protocol, there are 3 scopes of emissions. So these encompass your entire business's value chain, all of your emissions, both direct and indirect. So I'll break them down. So scope 1 is really quite straightforward. These are your direct company emissions that are coming from the fuel that you are burning. So this would likely be any gas usage associated with your company buildings, any fuel used from company-owned vehicles. Scope 2, these are the emissions created by a company indirectly but are associated with the production of energy. So for the vast majority of organizations, this is going to be the electricity that they use. And then we have scope 3, which is a little bit of a bigger beast, as it were. This includes all of your emissions not produced by the company itself, but that sit within the company's wider value chain. So we have both upstream activities. This is looking at the supplier-based emissions, for instance, and we also have downstream scope 3 emissions, and that might be looking at the products or projects that you're involved in and emissions associated with that. Not all of these 15 categories will be applicable for every single business. So depending on what kind of sector you sit within or what your business looks like, there will be a different kind of category boundary for you to consider when looking at your full net zero baseline, particularly for scope 3. So I'll just run through kind of a couple of examples of what that could look like for different kinds of business. So if you're a service-based business, if you're a consultancy, a law firm, if you're not necessarily making or selling any sort of products, then the emissions within your scope 3 are likely to sit within the upstream categories. So your typical significant categories will be things like purchased goods and services. And regardless of what business you are, that can often make up 60 to 70% of your overall carbon footprint. So it can be a really significant chunk anyway. But you won't necessarily need to worry too much about the downstream categories. If you are a product-based business, if you're manufacturing or selling products, then that's where these downstream categories might come into play. So the processing of sold products, that's if you're selling any intermediary products. For instance, if you're selling steel, which is then used to make a building, if you're selling wood that is then turned into furniture, that category would be relevant for you as a business. It's quite a rare one, to be honest. We don't see a huge amount of it unless you're in a specific sector. Category 11, use of sold products. This is looking at the energy associated with your products while they're in use. So if any of your products require electricity, require battery, require power of any sort, then category 11 is likely to be applicable for you. So if you're selling electronic items, then that one's relevant. And then category 12, end of life of treatment of sold products. That is looking at what happens to the product at the end of its lifetime. And that can be quite a tricky one to calculate from a data point of view. But as things progress, as we get kind of more granular level data, then we'll be able to understand that category in more detail. And I think that kind of touches on a wider theme around, particularly around scope 3. It can be a challenge to access the data required to measure this in a meaningful way. That doesn't act as an excuse not to start, if that makes sense. There are methodologies, there are tools that we can use, kind of stepping stone to getting us to that full net zero baseline in time at a point, at a pace that is ready for your business, as it were. Scope 3 can be up to 99% of the business's total carbon footprint. So it's a huge element of your emissions that you can't really neglect. It's really important to consider, particularly when you're looking at that net zero trajectory as well. I want to just pause for a moment and think specifically around this sector, particularly for developers, for main contractors, for people who are building buildings. Then there's a couple of other terms, phrases, terminology that are applicable for them, and also likely to fall within these downstream scope 3 emissions. So we've got whole life carbon. This essentially is the process through which you measure the carbon of a development that is associated with that building, all the way from extraction of raw materials, the delivery of those materials on site, any on-site activities that take place throughout the building process, the maintenance and any repairs, renovations associated with the building throughout its lifetime, and then any emissions associated with the end of life. All of those elements, 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 on the screen, they capture what we call embodied carbon. And then section 4, that is the operational carbon. That is forecasting the use of the building, the emissions associated with the building while it is in use across the building's lifetime. So these are broken down, whole life carbon is broken down into these 2 different categories, embodied and operational. As you can imagine, based on all of those different sections that the embodied carbon constitutes and consists of, that is the majority often of the whole life carbon of the building. For a distribution centre, for instance, your big warehouse, 70% of its total carbon often gets attributed to embodied carbon and 30% for operational. So there's an emphasis when we're looking at carbon reduction of developments, there is an emphasis on embodied carbon. So how can you reduce the carbon associated with the materials, with the processes, with the end of life of the building, for instance? So that's important to consider, I suppose, if you are a developer, an investor, a contractor who is actively involved in those sorts of projects. That's another factor to consider when you're looking at that scope 3, that net zero journey in particular. And then another term to touch on, which I think is thrown around a little bit interchangeably between net zero is carbon neutral. They are quite different. So I think it's important to highlight the differences. So net zero, as I mentioned, it requires measurement and radical reduction across scopes 1, 2, and 3. And the offsetting piece is really used as that kind of final stage for the residual unavoidable emissions of a maximum 10% of the baseline. So it's really focused on emissions reductions with net zero. Carbon neutral, by contrast, it does require measurement of scopes 1 and 2. It doesn't require a measurement of scope 3. And if you think about how significant scope 3 can be in total, that's where, a key chunk of the business's emissions might be neglected through carbon neutral. There is a carbon reduction plan that is required for scopes 1 and 2 with carbon neutrality as well. However, there's no carbon reduction target for scope 3. And ultimately, the focus of carbon neutral is on offsetting. So essentially, each year, the business is buying the equivalent offsets to its total carbon footprint. So it's offsetting each year as opposed to just at the end. And the way that we often frame it because carbon neutrality can get a bit of a bad rep, and I think it has been used for greenwashing in the past by some large corporates. And it's still, when done in the right way and when done with the right intention, it can be a useful stepping stone in that journey to net zero, but it shouldn't be confused with net zero as that end goal. And you can't, ultimately as a society, we're not going to resolve the climate crisis by offsetting alone. It really needs to be paired with dramatic reductions across all aspects of your emissions. Okay, brilliant. So that's a summary of some of the key terms, some of the key definitions around carbon, sustainability, net zero. But I think it's also important to kind of set this in the context of, why is it important? Why do I, as a business owner, need to be thinking about this? Why does it matter to me and the company that I work for? What is the imperative to dedicating time, resource, effort into sustainability as a business? And you can kind of break it down into these three different buckets. So firstly, we've got the moral imperative. Climate change is one of the greatest threats that we're facing, and ultimately we know that it's a race against time at this point, and it's the right thing to do. And then we have the commercial angle, and I think that's really important, because society, investors, consumers, they are all calling for greater transparency from businesses in terms of what their impacts on the environment and communities that they work within. In the last couple of years, we've seen this thing called ESG become a more inherent part of most business. And I'll explain a little bit more about ESG in a minute. But that's only going to increase. That's only going to become more important, particularly as businesses try to raise finance in a world that is transitioning towards net zero. So having a credible net zero strategy, a credible transition plan, that is going to become the cost of doing business. And then finally, we've got the legal imperative as well. So the UK has enshrined net zero into law. In the 2019 amendment to the Climate Change Act, the UK government committed to achieving net zero as a country by 2050 at the latest. So what that means is every UK business has to achieve net zero by then. So we have to do it. We know it's the right thing to do, and there's some significant commercial opportunities that come with doing it as well. So I'll break these down a little bit more and give some more insight. I think this has probably been seen by several people before. This is a really lovely visual by the Professor Ed Hawkins, and it illustrates the average global temperatures starting from 1850 on the left through to 2020 on the right. So it's a little bit outdated now, but I think in the last couple of years, we just need to add deeper shades of red, particularly last year, which was the hottest that we've ever experienced. And climate change manifests itself in floods, in wildfires, in heat waves, droughts. We're seeing it constantly in headlines. And these events, they have enormous implications, obviously, on our natural environment and the natural world, but also on societies and different populations as well. When we look at climate justice and the climate justice movement, there is a demand for wealthier countries to really recognise the responsibility that they have, both in the present and also historically, on the emissions that they have created or generated, and actually take radical action in reducing as much as possible. The global north is currently responsible for an incredible 92% of excess global carbon emissions, and that is predominantly driven by the overuse and development of fossil fuels. So the global north in particular has a really critical role to play in solving the climate crisis. So if we're going to avoid the most serious impacts of global warming, then we really need to make net zero a business priority. And in this sector in particular, there's no small part to play. I think that's really important to recognise. we're working in a really highly emitting industry. I mentioned earlier around the embodied and operational carbon, that constitutes a huge proportion of our global carbon emissions. And that comes not only from the construction of our existing buildings and new buildings, but also the operation and maintenance as well. But I think you can kind of flip it slightly, and this links to the next point around commercial drivers for net zero, because while we do have a really immense responsibility to make a difference, that is also an opportunity to drive meaningful change and to really see radical carbon reduction across the sector. So it's about how do we flip the dial, how do we change our perspective from this is a burden, this is a responsibility that we have to focus on, to this is an opportunity that we get to use and get to showcase. And that can be seen when you look at the commercial importance of sustainability. Businesses are increasingly under pressure from all sorts of stakeholders, from customers, from investors, from their staff and employees, to demonstrate their sustainability leadership in the sector. And we're at a point right now where by getting ahead and demonstrating how you are going above and beyond around sustainability, you have a really great commercial incentive to be able to utilize that, to make that a USP, to set yourselves apart from competitors and so on. So some really interesting statistics to highlight. I mean, 71% of employees want to work for businesses that have sustainable values. 80% of consumers of products and services will say that they consider sustainability in the choice of their supplier. And 80% of investors are starting to focus on sustainability within their ongoing investment. So across the board, you're seeing this becoming an increasing priority. And this is where ESG comes into play as well, particularly on the investment side of things. So again, another acronym that I'm sure everybody is familiar with: environmental, social, and governance. This is essentially a set of standards which measure a business's impact on the environment, but also on society, and how transparent and accountable it is. And 2/3 of investors are taking ESG factors into account when they're investing in a company at the moment, which means that ESG essentially has the potential to grow a business while also obviously benefiting the environment and community. So it's a win-win. And I really like the quote from Mark Carney that says, "The transition to net zero is creating the greatest commercial opportunity of our age." I think that really nicely encapsulates this kind of topic in particular, and the opportunity, again, that businesses have to really take advantage of this, do the right thing for the planet, but also for their business. And you can see this across all businesses as well. So larger companies are increasingly setting their own net zero targets. They're getting pressure from their investors, but also from legislative demands. So they are needing to measure their scopes 1, 2, and 3. And within their scope 3 sits their suppliers and their supply chain based emissions. And that's where they need to work with the supply chain, which often is predominantly SMEs, to proactively work towards net zero as well. So SMEs are now being asked to measure, reduce, and cut their own emissions. And you can see almost the kind of climate action cascades down the value chain really quite quickly. Much quicker, I'd say, than other pieces of legislation that we've seen historically. This is kind of a different approach because of that scope 3 piece and how integral your supply chain is in your own net zero journey. So ultimately, organizations are likely to prioritize suppliers and partners who are like-minded in that they share the sustainability objectives and priorities. So if you're an SME who's proactively working towards net zero yourself, then you're easily able to meet the criteria that larger businesses, larger clients and customers will be placing. That ensures that you are included within supply chains and in potential future business collaborations as well. So you're future-proofing the business from a commercial point of view by making sure that you're ticking and meeting the requirements of your clients from a sustainability angle. And you can also see when we look at the economy and the market, how important sustainability is becoming. So this slide and the next slide just kind of captures that a little bit, and particularly looks at the growth as well. So in 2023, the size of green technology and sustainability market accounted for 12.9 billion roughly. that's expected to reach nearly $49 billion by 2030. So within the space of 6-7 years, it's set to quadruple nearly in size in terms of what is the market for sustainability for green tech. And we're already seeing this huge growth in other elements as well. So this is looking at the UK's ethical consumer market that last year reached over £140 billion. And interestingly, the majority of that was driven by a surge in the second-hand clothing sector. But we also saw a spending on electric cars rise by over 80%. So consumers are looking increasingly towards clean energy as a source for powering their vehicles. And we also saw money in ethical banking and investment actually outstrip mainstream investment growth by growing by 1.5% as well. So you can see when compared to 1999 at 11.2 billion, how enormous that growth has been over the last 20 or so years. And that's only likely to increase as well. So if you're not already thinking about it, it would be wise from a business point of view to start looking at how you can invest in your own sustainability journey as well. So that's kind of the commercial angle. That links really closely actually to the legislative piece. And what we have here is what we call the regulatory waterfall, which demonstrates how it kind of cascades into the supply chain really nicely, I think. So it starts with international regulation. So these are the policies, updates that are generated out of events like the COP conferences or UN IPCC reports. And then we also have kind of international best practice standards and guidelines. So the UN's Race to Zero, the SBTi's Corporate Net Zero Standard, the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, things like that, that is basically establishing for all types of business, how do you get to net zero credibly? That's at the top. That then feeds into national targets and standards. So that's where we get national emission reduction targets from a legal point of view coming into effect. So that's where, for instance, the UK's commitment comes into play. And that influences large organisations in a variety of ways. And this is where we get a whole range of other acronyms around different pieces of policy. So SCCR, ESOS, TNFD, CSRD, PPN. I'm sure a couple of those are familiar, as are many others. It can feel really mind-boggling to try and keep on track. We do have some really useful tools, which I'll touch on shortly, that can help you understand what's relevant for you as a business and what might be coming down the pipeline as well. But these are the kind of things that are ultimately requiring larger organisations to start measuring and reducing their carbon emissions and setting net zero targets and working towards those reduction pathways. And that is where then, as I mentioned a minute ago, it trickles into the supply chain and towards SMEs as well. And there's a range, in addition to that, there's a range of industry-wide standards that businesses can choose to adopt. So we see that come through in supplier contracts, tender requirements, but we also have various guidelines that are up and coming and due to be released later this year, such as the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, which is essentially aiming to create clarity and consensus across the country as to what does a net zero building look like and how can it be achieved. So that comes into play as well in these kind of lower levels of the waterfall. But you can see, again, compared to other topics, other aspects of regulation, how quickly it trickles down. And I think that's one of the reasons why these constant updates and new legislation and policy that are being published is felt so quickly through all aspects of business, because it does affect each and every organisation, no matter what size and no matter what industry they're in. So yeah, so that concludes kind of the section that really looks at what a business, why net zero is important for a business, why they should be making it a priority. Obviously, it can increase the cost savings, where we like to say where there's carbon, there's cost. So by reducing carbon, you're often reducing your costs and your outgoings. But then there's also a huge competitive advantage to be gained from a commercial angle as well, both now and in the future. Another really key aspect is to highlight that it is becoming crucial in attracting and retaining talent and keeping the employee satisfaction as high as possible. But ultimately, net zero is about business transformation. It is not going to be an easy fix or a quick task that you can just get done and move on. It takes time, it takes resource and commitment from all different angles of the business, and ultimately it needs to be embedded and worked through consistently. And it's also important to recognise, particularly as these new updates, these new guidelines are emerging, that we don't have all of the answers at the moment. We're all very much on that learning journey together. But as I say, that's no longer an excuse for inaction. And actually, there's much to be gained from trying something new, from attempting something a little bit different, from learning from others within your sector and what they're doing to reduce their own carbon, and ultimately get started with this. So ultimately, it will very soon become a crucial part of doing business. And if you've got the opportunity to kickstart that journey now and get ahead of the curve, then why not, is kind of the approach that I have anyway. So yeah, so that is kind of summary of the presentation piece. I'm very happy to run through any questions that we've got, but before I do, I just wanted to touch on a couple of takeaways, a couple of things that you can do if interested in to follow up from this. So firstly, the UK Business Climate Hub, in partnership with Planet Mark a couple of weeks ago, launched the first UK net zero business census. So what this is the largest national research initiative of its kind. It's extremely ambitious, and it's aiming to establish a benchmark for the private sector's contribution to the UK's 2050 net zero target. That will in turn inform government policy and understanding of what needs to be implemented, what needs to happen in order to reach that 2050 net zero goal. So if you have got 10 minutes and you'd like to complete the census for your organisation, that would be a really, really good place to start. Secondly, and this goes back to that kind of three-pillared approach that Planet Mark often takes, it's not just for one person to think about this in a business. It's really a collective effort that is going to take you from where you are to where you want to go. So think about, how do you engage your team? How do you talk to them about sustainability? How do you upskill them? What kinds of things are they interested in? How important is this within your business already? Is it a part of your culture, or does there need to be some additional work around that? You know, starting to survey and get an understanding of where net zero sits within your business is a really good place to then look at what changes you can implement further down the line. And very similarly, start to engage your suppliers. We know how important your supply chain emissions are likely to be in your overall footprint. So what are some of your top suppliers doing already in sustainability? You might be pleasantly surprised and find that they are already on their journey, and that's going to help you massively. Or they might need a little bit of hand-holding. They might need some support and guidance on how they can kickstart their sustainability strategy as well. And you can be on that journey together. The penultimate thing is around knowledge. And I think sessions like this, sessions that you can go and learn more about sustainability around net zero, and also engage in conversation as well and make it really interactive. That's ultimately what's going to further the knowledge, further the understanding across the company. So we've got a number of free resources that you could take a look at. There's a webinar all around net zero coming up on the 30th of May. That will look at a little bit more deep dive into some of the aspects I spoke about today, but also involve some panel discussions and providing a more solutions focused of, okay, how can we tangibly achieve net zero? So that would be a really good session. You're more than welcome to register. All of the links are on the slides, and the slides will be circulated after the event. So you're more than welcome to register for that. We also have a whole host of toolkits and guides looking at all different aspects of what your carbon footprint reduction pathway might look like, net zero as a whole, social value, different aspects of sustainability and ESG. So by all means, have a look at those, see what is relevant for you, what key takeaways you can implement into the business now and then further down the line as well. And then going back to the policy piece again, we've got a carbon policy tracker tool. So this is a really useful, you can basically plug in some key details about your business, the size, the industry, kind of what space you're involved in. And then it essentially spits out what relevant policy you might need to be aware of or you should be thinking about, some guidelines and standards that you can look towards to provide you with that additional kind of resource and support. And also what could be coming down the pipeline as well. So that's a really useful tool if you are concerned, particularly around the policy thing. You might just be sitting at a threshold, so it might not be applicable just yet. But if you grew in size ever so slightly, then you do come under scope. That's a really great thing to explore as well. And then finally, I mean, I can answer any questions today, but if there is anything, if you have got any challenges, if there is anything you wanted to run through or discuss, you're very welcome to book in a complimentary carbon clinic using that link with one of our team to discuss your specific situation, where you're at as an organization and what you're looking to achieve and ultimately how you can practically get there. So you're very welcome to book that in. And alternatively, if you would rather just send a question through, then you can email me and the email is on there as well. So I've left a little bit of time and we've just got just over 15 minutes. So I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Ella. That was really insightful. And a lot of people still hanging around, so that was definitely interesting. You can pop your question in the Q&A function, and I'm sure Ella will try to answer all of them. But really good presentation, got me thinking a lot from our business side of things and where I'm sitting. And I understand like a lot of offices have their own ESG criterias now. They're moving into grade A office spaces, looking for it, but it's more than that. It's more holistic. It's environmental, social impact as well, and economic. And just a question from me. I know when you talked about scope 1, 2, and 3, from the business we are at, I think most of them are service-based. So where I sit and you sit at our homes, how do we impact? Because I'm pretty sure we're using so much carbon while working from home as well. So where does that fit in?
Yeah, it's interesting. So home working emissions get captured within category 7 of scope 3, which is employee commuting. So it's a little bit of a funny one in a way, because prior to COVID, in particular, there wasn't really any established methodology of calculating home working emissions for a business. And obviously since the pandemic, that has evolved to be a huge aspect of many people's working lives. Remote hybrid working has become kind of the norm in many businesses. So as such, we've had to evolve in terms of the methodologies to calculate that. It's still not quite where I think we would like it to be. There's a lot of benchmarking, a lot of estimations, and often when we're reporting on a business's carbon footprint, while we do include their home working emissions, it's heavily caveated because of the limitations to the methodology. But in terms of, yeah, often it is calculated using national averages. So that's where things beyond the business's control play into effect. So decarbonisation of the grid, for instance. But obviously, personally, there's lots that we can do within our own homes to try and make a little difference. And I think while it's important to think of it from a business angle, it's also really crucial to think of it of how can I make a difference in my personal life. So looking at your energy supplier is a really easy one. If there is an opportunity to move to a renewable tariff, often it's cheaper as well. I mean, we're with Octopus and they're great. It's really easy, straightforward to use and navigate. But also, where can you reduce and save carbon? How can you make the building more efficient? Is there the opportunity to install solar panels if you own the home, or have that available to you? But then there's a whole host of things, and we've got content around it, so I can share it as well around what can you do to save energy in the home. And it's incredible how switching a plug off every time you aren't using it, how much that adds up in terms of carbon and cost savings over the year. So particularly when we had the energy crisis, it was like, what can you do to save money? And that, you think it's such a minor thing, but if everybody in the business is doing it every single time, then that does add up. So yeah, so there's lots that we can do, but it's just about that education piece, I think, more than anything.
No, you're right. I mean, that would be useful, how to save energy, like when you're working from home and stuff. And glad you mentioned the electricity prices, because it's such a, I mean, morally you want to switch to electric, but it's costlier than gas. So it does keep you conflicted, like how much effort, even businesses, like how much can they move ahead, and housing. If I want to connect to heat networks, it's really difficult to get that around and stuff. So it's like more a personal choice as well, and you get conflicted.
Yeah, and that's where we need that broader support from government and from kind of industry leading organizations and things like that to support with those kinds of things. And I don't know what the solution is there, whether it's subsidies or innovation and technology, so that it's more readily available, probably a combination of lots of different things. But it is, while it is somewhat beyond our immediate control, there's a lot that we can do around influencing and guiding. So that's where the net zero census comes into play, because it's about giving decision makers the information that they have, that they can then disseminate and utilize and guide policy and changes. So yeah, while we can't necessarily make a direct difference, there's things we can do to hopefully have an impact still.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it goes a lot in educating them as well. What exactly, like you mentioned about operational carbon versus embodied carbon, it's such a huge debate that goes into it, because life cycle contains more than that, and we just look at, even EPCs look at just one aspect of it. I'm glad that they're reforming EPCs and it's gonna come around, but it's a huge debate, and it's more about informing them that what goes into our building, and supply chain, logistics, all of them have to understand as well. And
Yeah.
I guess you have stunned everyone, so no one's asking any questions, but I would encourage, if anyone has any more questions, feel free to ask. Yeah.
That's no problem. Yeah. Also, my email is on the slide, so very happy to pick up anything after the session as well. So yeah, no problem. Everyone's getting the sun.
Yeah, everyone's busy having their lunch, I guess. Thank you so much, and we will share the slides after this webinar with everyone. If you have any more questions, you can feel free to email it to us or directly to Ella. And thank you so much for joining. Happy Friday and happy weekend when it comes. Thank you.
Thank you so much.